Dopamine, the signal transduction pathway to happiness, by Nicole Lamanna and Lindsay Urban.
There are three stages of cell signaling. The first one, reception, is when a chemical signal binds to a cellular protein, typically at the cell surface. The next step, transduction, is when the binding leads to a change in the receptor that brings about a specific cellular response. The final stage, response, is when there is a specific cellular response to the signal.
In the brain, dopamine will function as a stimulatory neurotransmitter. It'll cause neurons to fire. Both the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area produce dopamine. Dopamine has multiple functions in the brain, including important roles in cognition and behavior, voluntary movement and motivation. It will also play a role in sleep and mood.
A neuron is a specialized cell that transmits nerve impulses. The gap from where an electrical signal jumps from one neuron to another is called the synaptic cleft. Synaptic vesicles are where dopamine is stored after it gets produced. Dopamine will get released through the process of exocytosis when there is an influx of calcium ions.
After dopamine gets released, it will bind to one of the dopaminergic receptors on the postsynaptic neuron.
Dopamine will only bind to the receptors that are specific for it. There are a few different types, however, they are all G-protein coupled receptors whose signaling is primarily mediated by interactions with GTP binding protein.
When dopamine binds with its receptor, it triggers a conformational change in the protein. Molecule X then binds to the protein and a molecule of GDP gets traded with a molecule of GTP.
Molecule X then gets turned on. It'll release from the protein.
It will activate an enzyme. The enzyme will then convert ATP to cAMP. cAMP is the second messenger.
Cyclic AMP will then travel through the cytoplasm and will activate the enzyme protein kinase A, or pKa, which then phosphorylates multiple substrates by attaching phosphates to them. Each step in this cascade further amplifies the initial signal, and the phosphorylation reactions mediate both short and long-term responses in the cell. This ultimately leads to the feelings of sedation and well-being.
A drug that affects dopamine is heroin.
Before heroin enters the system, inhibitory neurotransmitters are active in the synapse. These neurotransmitters inhibit dopamine from being released.
When the body's natural opiates activate opiate receptors, the release of inhibitory neurotransmitters is shut down. Without inhibition, dopamine can be released.
Heroin mimics natural opiates and binds to opiate receptors, turning off dopamine inhibition. Dopamine is allowed to flood the synapse, producing immediate feelings of sedation and well-being.
Neurons with opiate receptors are in parts of the brain responsible for the transmission of pain signals, stress response, and emotional attachment. Our body's opiates are natural painkillers, effective when we have sustained massive injury. This is why morphine, a drug related to heroin, is used as a painkiller. Review questions.
What occurs normally before heroin enters the system?
In the synapse, inhibitory neurotransmitters are active where they inhibit dopamine from being released.
Where is dopamine stored after it gets produced?
In vesicles.
What does heroin mimic?
Natural opiates.
What drug that is related to heroin is used as a painkiller?
Morphine.
What happens when heroin binds to opiate receptors?
Dopamine inhibition is turned off.
What happens when inhibition is turned off?
Dopamine floods the synapse.
What does dopamine flooding the synapse cause feelings of?
Feelings of sedation and well-being.
What areas of the brain produce dopamine?
The substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area.
What stage of cell signaling is when a chemical signal binds to a cellular protein?
Reception.
What multiple functions does dopamine serve in the brain?
It controls behavior, cognition, voluntary movement, and motivation. It will also play a role in one's sleep and mood.